And as we move through this extraordinary time in human history, as always, I welcome the chance to talk to our next guest. Professor Richard Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also currently a visiting professor in the graduate program of international affairs of the New School University in New York. And as always, he is the host of Economic Update Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV. So, first of all, Richard Wolff, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And I wanted to start off as we move to what seems to me to be the next phase of the pandemic. People are sort of in certain places beginning to open up or think about opening up to a slightly more normal level of economic activity. And one statistic jumped out at me. Maybe this is where I'll start, which is that collectively, since the crisis began in mid-March, we have learned that America's billionaires got nearly $500 billion richer over the course of this unfolding crisis up to now, that Jeff Bezos added $34.6 billion in wealth. Mark Zuckerberg, lagging behind, only picked up $25 billion during the course of this pandemic so far. And I guess I would start with this question. Are people going to be able to, assuming we are moving out of it, and who knows, there could be a second wave, are people going to be able to hold on to what I think has been an awareness of the unfairness of the process altogether as we move out of it? Or are they going to slip back into what is sometimes called a false consciousness, where in effect they think if the billionaires are doing all right, I must be doing all right too?
Well, I think, and I'm hoping that I am not allowing my wish to govern my analysis, but that's always a risk with everyone. I want to believe, let me be very honest, that people will understand that a virus does not redistribute wealth, but capitalism does. When in the course of a human community like the United States, a viral threat emerges like corona, the question is, how does the society respond? How does it cope? How does it manage? And that involves preparing for and then working out a way to get through it. None of that, getting through it together, fighting the virus, protecting ourselves, none of that requires, nor is that in any way assisted by redistributing wealth, especially not the way it was done in the United States over the last 9 weeks, from the poor and the middle to those who were already the richest. That is an achievement of our capitalist economic system. It has nothing to do with fighting a virus or being attacked by a virus. And so I would hope, here comes the punchline, I would hope that the American people, if not right now, then within the coming months or weeks or months, will understand that under the umbrella of a viral threat to our health and our very lives, we as a society did not get together as fellow human beings to fight this threat and to help one another survive. No, whatever we did along those lines, we were also engaged, given the way our economic system works, in taking wealth from large numbers of poor and middle people and giving it to the richest, as per the statistics you quoted. There is no excuse for that. It is unethical, immoral, unnecessary, and nothing short of perverse and obscene that the richest man in the United States, for example, Mr. Bezos, should have become much richer still while we had 100,000 people dying and millions infected, etc., etc. Let me hammer home as a final part of this one mechanism that is not well understood as to why the middle and the bottom of the United States is paying for the enriching of those at the top. According to the Washington Post, we now have 38.6 million Americans that have lost their jobs in the last 2.5 months, roughly. Okay. Not only are those people now plunged into an unspeakable situation, for most of them, they have lost not just a job, but the bulk of their income. For most of them, and many of them don't get any unemployment insurance, but for those who do, that represents not only a pay cut, but something that is going to run out and before much longer. And then what? But beyond the immediate loss of job and loss of income, most of these people are now facing a terror. They don't know if the job they had will be there. Mm-hmm. They don't know whether the job they had, even if it's there, will be the same job that they left. And let me explain why. Because if you get this, you will also understand why the unemployment of 38.6 million is a direct threat to the remaining still employed part of the American working class. And here's how it works. With unemployment at this size, every employer is offered a really interesting opportunity. Every employer now knows, whether he or she admits it to others, whether he or she admits it even to themselves, here's their opportunity. You can cut the wages you offer the people who are still working for you. You can cut the benefits you provide them. You can make them come a half an hour earlier. You can make them take a shorter lunch break. You can make them work at a faster rate. You can do whatever you want. Why? Because if they don't like it, if they will not accept it, well, then they can quit, can't they? And you won't mind because you've got 38.6 million other people out there to offer the job at the new reduced conditions too. And remember, the unemployed people, having lost a job, being worried about the future, they're using up whatever savings they might have had. They're becoming burdens on the fellow family members' incomes that they have to tap into. They are desperate to get back to work. Of course they are. And so if the only job they can get is one that pays less than it used to, with benefits fewer than they used to be, they'll take the job. And the employers know it. And even if you find a nice employer who wouldn't take advantage of the situation, the competitors to that nice employer, they will. And that will force the nice employer to do likewise. So what you're seeing, and you're going to see more and more of it in the weeks and months ahead, as we linger with enormous overhangs of unemployment, you're going to see the destruction of the standards of living and working for millions and millions of Americans, including those who never lost their jobs. And that wealth being taken from them as we speak is the wealth being moved over to the richest among us. It is something which I am sure, and this I'm sure of, future historians will look back at this moment, end of May, beginning of June 2020, and shake their heads in wonderment that there wasn't more of a massive opposition to this state of affairs.
And that's exactly, Richard Wolff, what I've been thinking about, and what I was thinking about specifically in bringing up this idea of false consciousness before any of this happened. Let's say between the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic, and especially in the years, the very recessionary years after the 2008 financial crisis, which let us not forget was caused by Wall Street greed. So in the years after the financial crisis, it seemed, and we've talked about this before, it seemed like, well, maybe people will start to get it, that especially politicians and commentators, that greed can't go unchecked. But this false consciousness, and that somehow the billionaires and oligarchs running society must be better, superior people, and that pervades all the way down to many working people. Now, they might be right wingers who think that the Koch brothers are their ideal. It might be Democratic professional people who think that, oh, well, the Koch brothers, we don't like them, but Bezos and Zuckerberg, they wear T-shirts and hoodies or whatever they're called. But this notion that somehow, if people weren't making it in this unfair economy, because of this belief that the billionaires and wealthy were doing it right, they must believe they're doing it wrong. When I was writing about foreclosures early on after the 2008 crisis, I got emails from people saying they thought they were the only ones. They thought their home foreclosure was a personal failure, and a couple of them said they were thinking of killing themselves, which to me seems to be the ultimate internalizing of a system that says billionaires are winners because they're better, not because it's a rigged system. And all this is a long roundabout way, Richard Wolff, for me to ask you whether the relative passivity of people not rising up, marching in the streets, and so on so far in any numbers, suggests that maybe that false consciousness is keeping people in line more maybe than I would have expected it would.
Well, I agree mostly. I think I would slightly tilt it in a bit of a historical direction. Let me explain.
Okay.
Consciousness, and this is a point very brilliantly made by Karl Marx in his writings, particularly in one of his early works that got published as a book with the title The German Ideology. And in that book, as in others of his writings, he talks about consciousness as lagging reality. In other words, it takes time for settled ways of thinking to change, to give way to new and different ways of thinking. It doesn't happen overnight. The conditions that give rise to a certain way of thinking change eventually. And when they change, they will eventually change people's consciousness. But it takes time. There's a period of time, and sometimes it's a matter of weeks and months. Sometimes it's a matter of decades. It takes time for, in a sense, this is not Marx's language, it's mine, for consciousness to catch up, for consciousness to begin to realize that old ways of thinking really have to be put aside, that we were wrong about something. Now, let me give you an example of when consciousness was changed radically in a short amount of time here in the United States. During the war, Second World War, roughly 1941 to 1945, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, had regular communication with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Russians and Russian communists and the Soviet government and people and leadership were represented as our friends, our allies, which they were in the war. Our enemies were the Japanese and the German Nazis, etc. And we were to be friends with the Russians and the Soviets. They were our allies. We were fighting a war together. Each of us had the other's back, etc. Come the end of the war and the development within a few months of a new Cold War, and consciousness had to be changed quickly and radically. The United States decided not to be allied with the Soviet Union, but to go even further and declare the Soviet Union to be the arch enemy, the evil other, all of the rest of it that we know from the Cold War. You had to change Americans' consciousness quickly. So you demonized communists of all kinds. You arrested and deported the leaders of the American Communist Party. You arrested Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and put them to death as part of a program to quickly and radically change consciousness. And for the last 70 years since those days, the United States has, demonized everything having to do with socialism, communism, Marxism, anarchism, you name it. You all know it. We've all lived through it. Okay, why do I tell you this? Because a consciousness developed over the last 70 years, endlessly rehashed, endlessly re-affected, re-announced, with little or no counter information or counter argument offered in the United States. I mean, I like to tell people that here I am, a professor of economics. I went to the elite schools of this country. I had my undergraduate degree from Harvard. I then went on and studied economics at Stanford in California. And I finished and got my PhD in economics at Yale University. 10 years of my life in what are arguably the pinnacle of the American higher education system. During that time, no one in the economics faculty in these three universities assigned me one word of Karl Marx's criticisms of capitalism. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's not a sign of a balanced education. That's a silly joke. That's the behavior of people terrified, so terrified that even though they're professors and even though they have tenure, which is a kind of job security, they could not dare answer the questions that I and other students asked about flaws and failures and problems of capitalism. The whole point is that there's a delay, and we have to understand that capitalism, which not that many years ago was celebrating with Fukuyama the end of history and the notion, Tina, that there is no alternative and that capitalism has won the struggle. We are now seeing in the first 20 years of this new century, capitalism has had three major crashes. This is the worst ever in this new century and looks to be about as bad as the horrible one of the 1930s. That capitalism is not out of the woods. Capitalism is not secure. Capitalism doesn't carry the day. In fact, capitalism is a very stark failure. As I speak, the United States, let's remember, we have 5% of the world's population and 30% of the world's deaths from the coronavirus. That's because our system didn't manage it real well, even though we boast of being one of the richest countries in the world. I think you're going to see a crescendo of criticism of capitalism. It's delayed, but it is not for that reason going to be any weaker or less profound. The Great Depression of the 1930s, let's remember, was followed by huge political changes and upheavals. In the United States, we went as a nation to our left politically. We suddenly had a government that was providing Social Security, which it had never done before, unemployment insurance, which it had never done before, a minimum wage, which it had never done before, and public jobs, 15 million of them between 1934 and 41, which it had never done before. And we had equally profound political changes coming out of the Great Depression in Germany, a country in which the socialists were pretty strong all through the 1920s. But a desperate business community turned to a right-winger, an extreme right winger, Adolf Hitler, made a deal with him, and the country there lurched to the right even further than America lurched to the left. But the point is to understand very big changes in consciousness, in politics, in behavior, in everything that matters were the consequence of an economic crash rather like the one we're living through.
Well, in a sense, Richard Wolff, you made me feel a little better, as terrible as things are. And I guess that's because this notion of the delayed effect of a major event, cataclysmic event in this case, in terms of people's thinking, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it seems that the other thing that I was thinking while you were talking was that I did some work behind what this country used to call, I believe, thanks to Winston Churchill, the Iron Curtain. If that is not an ideologically charged phrase, I don't know what is, but starting in the late 80s, going through the mid 90s. So one of the things that gave me in terms of perspective was the awareness that institutions, governments, and even beliefs that people consider immutable can change. And not only can they change, but they can change in years, not decades. And if that's the case, then to me, for those of us who think that change and major change, enormous change is needed for human survival, among other things, as well as for justice and other purposes, the question is, well, what can people who think about that in the way you or I might, what can those of us with these beliefs do to foster that change?
Well, I think it would be important to talk about it, to talk about the lag, to give the historical examples, to make the people that are just this side of becoming active in opposition to what's going on, to make them feel able and encouraged to take that next step and to cross over into the line of people committed to some form of active engagement. Let me give an example of a conversation I had recently with some colleagues from Germany. And I asked them to explain to me why the German response to the coronavirus has been and is so different from the American. And I gave as the example unemployment. In the United States, unemployment, as I said, we have 38.6 million people out of work, an unemployment rate, depending on how you count, around 17%, give or take. It went from 4% 2.5 months ago to 17%. That's more than quadrupling. In Germany, at the beginning, back in late February, early March, unemployment was 5%. Today, unemployment in Germany is 6%. Not only did it not quadruple, it basically didn't go very well, didn't go very far. Roughly 200,000 people have lost their jobs in Germany versus 38.6 million in the United States. There is no comparison. What in the world is going on? Answer. In Germany, the government is helping companies through the pandemic, but on one condition. You will get money from us. We will help you through the pandemic. But in return, you can't fire anybody. You can't lay anyone off. You keep everyone on the payroll, whether they come into work or not. And we will help cover 80% of their wages and salaries, but there is no unemployment. I find this stunning. And I as I tell it to Americans, I can see in their faces that, of course, they don't know. And that's part of why our mass media exists, to make sure we don't know. But the answers they gave me were wonderful evidence for what you and I have been discussing. They said the business community in Germany knows and deeply believes that if they did what you do in America, if they threw millions of people out of work, that the trade unions, the Socialist Party, which remains strong in Germany, the further left party, it's called the Left Party, also strong in Germany, they could not keep the lid on that society. The business community finds it's too dangerous to risk doing what the Americans do, so they won't do it. Now, time will tell us whether the wisdom was on the side of the capitalists in Germany not pulling the kind of unemployment we have, or whether the Americans were right and that they can, because of the weakness of the American left, which they've destroyed over the last 70 years as best they could, whether that enables them to do something which their German counterparts would not dare try to do.
And Richard Wolff, the corollary to that in terms of what business executives might or might not do is that we have a political system here, a government here, where nobody would consider predicating aid to business on that kind of condition, that you have to keep your workers in order to get this assistance. So, and I assume that's because in German politics, leaders of, I would guess, all major parties understand that if they did not offer a strong program of worker protection, they'd be out of a job.
That's right. And that would be their best outcome. They'd be out of a job. Their worst outcome is that they would be made the scapegoat of history. They would be made, the inheritors of the conflagration that ended Nazism in Germany and all the rest of it. They're terrified. They're not going to go in that direction because they know in their guts that it's not a viable political option. They can't do that. And the reason for that is, again, your point about consciousness. Consciousness in Germany has been shaped ever since the Second World War, that the right-wing solution, the solution that allows a smaller and smaller number of people to become wildly wealthy, that allows an unchecked, unregulated capitalism to do its thing, that risks ending up in the disaster of Hitler and Nazi, and they're not going anywhere near there. It's like teaching a child not to touch the hot stove. That child stays a nice long distance from that hot stove, and that consciousness lasts. Eventually it'll pass if nothing else happens, but for the time being, it's still strong enough in Germany, reinforced by a strong labor movement, a strong socialist and communist presence throughout the society. I mean, try to understand, it's hard for Americans, I know, try to understand that in countries like Germany or France or Italy, if you have a reasonably large family, there's going to be at least one person, Aunt Matilda or Uncle Frank, who is a socialist, who is a communist, who is a Marxist, who is an active trade unionist. And you're going to have family get-togethers over the dinner table. You're going to have picnics. You're going to have birthdays to celebrate. And you're going to be in close contact with these people. And if you say something offensive to the way they think, they'll probably let you know. And you will understand that things you say and believe have impact on other people. And if you don't want them to hurt your feelings, well, then you better not hurt theirs. And if you want them to understand your position, well, then you better make an effort to understand theirs. And over time, you listen to each other. You don't have to agree, of course, but there's a different attitude. You understand in the intimacy of your family that there are people who think like that. You won't be able to forget it. I notice when I talk to, which I do occasionally, to political leaders in the United States, congresspersons, senators, mayors, governors, when I talk to the political leaders here in the United States, I do pick up a sense they have no idea what is going on here. I mean, I know we're supposed to believe that politicians keep their ears to the ground to make sure they're aware of what their constituent. I don't find that to be the case. I think what has happened is that constituents are listened to if and when they have money, and that therefore the constituents that get their ear are those who are wealthy and or are in the business community. Those are the voices they hear. Those are the voices they talk to. Those are the families into which they marry their children. Those are the people they play golf with, go to dinner with. And so the rest of us, yeah, they know kind of we're there, but they don't know what we're thinking. They're going to be the last ones to understand that the consciousness has changed.
And that's Richard Wolff, I wanted to jump in for a second because I thought maybe you were going somewhere else. You were talking about family members who are probably socialists or whatever you might not even know, and they're going to start to speak up. That made me really think about. In fact, I was just talking to my wife this morning about one of my grandfathers, and I was saying, he had a tailor shop on the Upper West Side, and I think he was probably a socialist and just never talked about it. And I guess where I'm going is that whether you consider yourself a socialist or a leftist of another kind, whether you think more things should be more sectors of the economy should be nationalized. I mean, I've been shocking people for years in friendly conversation when they, I think the big banks should be broken up and nationalized. I'll do that, but I thought maybe where you were going was that, as with other forms of what used to be called social deviancy, to hush it up, right? Like you couldn't admit to anyone if you were gay. It used to be you couldn't, admit certain beliefs to anyone in public. That maybe more and more people are willing to admit they hold beliefs on the left, they think we should do more collectively and communally. They're socialists, however they envision it in their own minds, that sort of artificial barbed wire fence of there are some things you just can't talk about because they're too far left, that maybe if we break them down more and more in our personal lives and social lives, that will help break them down in our political lives as well.
Richard, one of the few things I'm sure of that's already happening. The best organizer for a change of consciousness in the United States right now are people who are 35 years of age and under. And the arena in which they are doing the work, and most of them are not even aware of what I'm saying, is when they go home and reconnect with their parents' generation around a birthday, an anniversary, a death, a family celebration, whatever it is. Conversations are happening over a cup of coffee or a beer or on a walk or caring for children that are different from the conversations that happened before in this country. There is a shift going on, and there's nothing the government can do about it, and there's nothing that the business community can do about it. And the business community and the government are so disconnected from average Americans that they don't know about it. And because it's not advertised, it's not out there in some demonstrably public way, it goes like, as if it were sort of under the surface. It really isn't. The minute you inquire, you learn about it. I mean, just make it very personal, a piece of fact for you. The number of invitations I got before 2015 to speak about or to explain verbally or in written form what socialism is and why I would urge people to learn more about it, I would say I got that less than once a year. Over the last 5 years, I get it once a week. So, it is startling. And by the way, I get some of these invitations from people who are clearly opposed. So sure. For example, yesterday I spent time talking with a representative of the Fox News network on this subject. That was not, I assume, I don't even know, but I assume that person was not favorably disposed, although we had a perfectly fine conversation. But most of my invitations are from people who are anywhere from mildly interested to very intensely enthusiastic. They want to learn. They know I do this stuff. I've written these books. I lecture on the subject. So I'm in seventh heaven. I mean, the interest that I see in my life should comfort people like you that there is something enormously different going on in the American public mind. And that, yes, you may not see it today and you may not see it next week, but boy, are you going to see it as time goes on.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking that I wrote a piece for Salon in 2014, which was given the headline, "Let's Nationalize Google and Amazon." And literally, I felt like nobody defended me in 2014. They thought I was out of my mind. Now that's a mainstream part of the discourse. So,
Absolutely.
So I would hope that, well, you've given me hope and optimism, and without sugarcoating anything, and I really appreciate it. So as always,
let me give you
sure.
one more boost if we have a moment there, Richard.
Absolutely.
You were ahead of your time. People who study the history, look, it was once unthinkable to nationalize the railroads. We did it. It was once unthinkable to nationalize an electric grid system. TVA, which exists to this day, we did it. On and on and on. The idea that we would break up a big company because it was a monopolist we wouldn't tolerate. That's what AT&T was, and it was broken up. I understand the limits and the contradictions, but the notion that something as universally positioned as a monopolist, the way Amazon is becoming and that Facebook and so forth are becoming, and that turning the whole world, including the capitalists who have to pay them exorbitant prices, that they might end up being nationalized or broken up. That is not far-fetched. That is not weird. That's part of American history. And Amazon, Google, and the others are right in line by their own development, as if they didn't study the history. Their demand for more and more freedoms to acquire more and more monopoly power, they are themselves bringing about the thing they hate most.
Well, again, silver lining or more, a bright vision of the future, and one we should all redouble ourselves to try to create. So Richard Wolff, economist, host of Economic Update, Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV. As always, a great pleasure speaking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure too, and I look forward to our next talk.